Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Eric Fields, a psychologist specializing in addiction. Today, I'm going to be discussing the general reason why so many people get stuck in these addiction patterns of behavior. So, on a very general level, the reason why people get stuck in any kind of behavioral pattern is quite simply due to an unconscious conflict that they are trying to avoid. So, a pattern of addiction or a pattern of unhealthy behavior really has so much to do with avoidance. As human beings, we tend to want to avoid big life decisions or predicaments, etc., etc. So there is a very high likelihood if you are stuck in a pattern of addiction right now, whether it be from drugs or related to alcohol or gambling, that you are stuck because you are avoiding making a decision. And because you're so stuck and paralyzed in a sense, that means that this decision is a biggie. People rarely get stuck in unhealthy behaviors because they are struggling with a small decision, like what should I eat tonight, right? Or maybe even like I'd say, a medium degree decision, like should I get a dog or not? I'm not saying that's a small decision, but more of like a medium sized decision, right? Now, we get stuck on the biggies. A lot of times, these big decisions are kind of, choice A or choice B, but choice A and choice B, there is a lot of evidence for each one, right? So, in other words, if you're trying to make a decision, should I stay at my current job or leave it? There is like a mountain of evidence of why you should stay and a lot of evidence for why you should go. Because if there was a lot of evidence on either this side or this side, the decision would be simple, right? Even if it was a big decision, if it was an overwhelming amount of evidence, it would be pretty simple. And I should add to this that your perception is the most important when we're talking about this. So, in other words, the evidence that you have in your mind in this example to either stay at your job or leave your job is what you believe to be the evidence, what you believe to be the reality of the situation. So it's not necessarily the actual situation, but it's in your mind. For example, if you think that you're going to have such a hard time getting a new job, but that's not the reality of the situation, you're going to operate right in a very different way, and that is in a fear-based way. Like, I'm not going to try to leave my job. That no way, because I don't feel like I'm going to be able to get a new one, right? So even if the evidence contradicts that assumption, if you don't know that there's evidence out there contrary to what you believe, you are not going to make that move. And so a lot of times you get paralyzed by these big decisions and you don't want to make them, right? So why don't we want to make these big decisions, even if they're challenging? Like, all right, what's the worst that can happen? Well, the worst that can happen is you make the wrong decision. And if we're talking about small decisions like what do I eat for dinner tonight, not such a big deal. Although I have found some people that really get stuck on small decisions as well. But definitely with a big decision, right? Like there's more on the line with that, right? So if you decide to leave your job and then you wind up in a far worse situation than you're in currently, you're going to be kicking yourself, right? However, if you're seriously contemplating leaving your job, you must have really good reasons for it. So you must really not like your job, or it's not fulfilling, or it really doesn't feel like you're calling, or it's a kind of situation that's just downright toxic. And so you're stuck. It's like, do I stay or do I go? If I stay, there's such a risk, more time of not being unfulfilled and being at this toxic job. If I go, my situation might even be worse, or I might be without a job for a long time. That might really set me back financially. So, a lot of times what human beings will do will be to avoid, right? So, does that mean that everyone who has a really big life decision that they should be making and are avoiding it wind up having an addiction? No. So, why do certain people find this situation so much more intolerable than other people? Well, quite simply, they might have a lower tolerance for this kind of big life decision. And this may cause them a lot more stress and anxiety than, let's say, a typical person. So that could be a big thing. Okay. Another reason is for them, it's easier to avoid and kind of push out of their consciousness. And, in the short term, it seems to work for them. But again, only in the short term, where other people, there's kind of like no denying it, right? Like they don't have the luxury of denial. So those behaviors wouldn't work for them. So they don't even think about doing those behaviors because they're like, no, it's still going to be on the forefront of my mind. But other people are more able to kind of push it back to the backs of their minds by doing these kinds of behaviors. So in other words, what I'm saying is you're not crazy for doing this. Like this behavior actually does work. It does the job that you intended it to do, which is to avoid the problem. Of course, by doing that, the problem becomes much, much worse and has this insidious impact on you because now it's really creating this harmful behavioral pattern, which has all sorts of negative consequences. And then, of course, the further down the road the further down the road you kick the can, right? The harder it's going to be to really address this issue. So those are some main reasons as to why people go the compulsive addictive route rather than not and just trying to deal with it. So these are things that you have to really start thinking about. Why am I stuck in this behavioral pattern? What could I possibly be avoiding that is a big decision? Another big decision that comes to mind, another big human adult kind of problem is if you're in a relationship and you're on the fence, this is a serious committed relationship, maybe you're married and you're trying to figure out, should I stay with this person or should I leave them? And again, it's kind of like, right, there's a lot of evidence to stay and there's a lot of evidence to leave them. And again, all based on your perception. So again, people get stuck with this kind of decision and not wanting to make the wrong decision and being so fearful of making the wrong decision, they choose to just avoid it. And again, in the short term, it does provide some temporary relief, but at the cost of all these longer term problems. Here's another one that's a biggie in terms of, big adult decisions that could paralyze us. Whether or not to have a kid, some major decision related to our kids. Or it could be the type of situation where there are just so many types of decisions and different roads we could take that becomes so overwhelming that could paralyze us. Like, in other words, I want to figure out what I want to do in my life, and there's so many options, and it's so overwhelming to think about. There's just so many possibilities here. Or any derivative of that, right? Any kind of situation where there's just so many different choices, and big decisions could really kind of we could really get caught up with big decisions at a young age, at like 18. Like, do we go away to college or do we stay local? Or do we go to college at all rather than, you know, start working? Do we take a gap year, right? That's very popular with the young ones. So, you know, these big life decisions can really happen at any stage of our adult development. And towards like, you know, the farther end of the spectrum, should I retire or not? And again, there's a good case to be made to retire, and there's a good case not to be made to retire. And so people who are stuck in an addictive behavioral pattern are really paralyzed very often by these big life decisions that they just don't want to make. They are more vulnerable than most people in terms of, let's say, making the wrong decision. And so here's the thing, again, like, you're not crazy. Like, many people with an addiction are people who are very vulnerable way before the addictive behavior ever came along. They're very vulnerable in certain specific ways. They don't tolerate big changes well. They don't tolerate disappointments well. They don't tolerate stress really well or discomfort. And having to make a big life decision is very anxiety provoking, very uncomfortable, very stressful. And the other thing that they're very vulnerable with is dealing with consequences of their actions, which I know sounds ironic when you think about them getting caught up in this addictive behavioral pattern, but you have to understand, in the short term, they have concluded that it's worth it. Even though it's got all these bad long-term consequences and results, they live in the short term because they just can't deal with that short-term discomfort. And they're willing to sabotage themselves and put themselves at risk for all these negative long-term consequences just for that short-term relief. And a lot of times this is just simply based on false assumptions. They just assume that they're not going to be able to deal with it. Their assumption in terms of them being very vulnerable and having less tolerance with anxiety and stress and uncomfortable life situations and decisions, that's accurate. But the degree that they elevate it to in their mind, where I will not be able to deal with that at all, this is going to be impossible to deal with, I'll be so uncomfortable, I'll never get through this, that's false, right? And, you know, the only way of dealing with this is first becoming aware of what that big life decision is that you're grappling with, and then facing it and telling yourself that, yeah, maybe I will have more of a hard time than most people dealing with this big decision and dealing with this big decision's results, especially if it doesn't work out, than most people. But I can still do it. I can still get through it. And here's the thing, which I'm sure you intuitively know. If you face these big decisions and you pull the trigger and make a choice, even if it doesn't work out the best way, just the fact that you did it and you faced your problem is going to make you so much more resilient as a human being. You're going to be able to cope with adversities the more that you build up these coping skills, because your coping skills are like muscles, and if you don't exercise them, they atrophy, right? They shrink. And so right now, look at this as a big, major exercise to strengthen your coping skills. And every time you face your life's challenges, you build those coping skills bigger and more effective and stronger. And the only way to do that is by having courage to face these big decisions and any issues that you have, and just kind of press on and face your fears and just do it. Because I guarantee you, even if the result of your decision goes south and it's not a good result, it turns out to be like, in other words, you kind of have like buyer's remorse, and you're saying to yourself like, oh crap, like I would have been so much better off if I had chosen the other path. You're still going to progress and develop as a human being. I can't emphasize that enough. Like, this is how you really progress as a human being. This is how you get closer and closer to your actual potential, right? By forcing yourself to deal with these kinds of uncomfortable situations. And that is the only way that we change for the better and progress, even if those situations turn out to be the result of, not the best decision or choice. It's far better to make a bad choice than no choice at all. Because look at what you're doing to yourself. You're trying to avoid making some kind of major decision, and look at all the havoc that you have, caused upon yourself because of this, right? And what you're really doing is wasting time. And that is tragic, right? Because if you put your life on hold for 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe even a decade, right? 10 years or so, I mean, that's tragic, right? I mean, no decision could be that bad, right? In terms of being worth putting your life on hold for that long. So, this is something to really think about. If you are stuck in some kind of unhealthy behavioral pattern like an addiction, and you're feeling paralyzed and you just can't understand why, there is a very high likelihood that this is the reason. This is Dr. Fields. I hope you found this video helpful, and I will have more to say about this at another time.